she said you pronounce your name wrong.
I do pronounce my name wrong.
Yeah. She said, my mother's like, it's Iorio. I go, there's no way you get him to say that.
But I can't go around saying Iorio. You know what I mean? It just doesn't.
You have to do this when you do it.
Yeah,
you have to do this.
Exactly.
It almost sounds like Yuri, which is a very typical, Slavic name.
Welcome back to the Futures Edge podcast. I'm Jim Urio. With me, as always, is Bob Iacchino, who's the brains behind the operation and co-host. And today we have a special guest. It's going to be a little bit of a different show. Instead of focusing strictly on domestic macroeconomics, we're going to talk a lot about geopolitical stuff. We have Velina Tchakarova, who is the founder of FACE, which is a geopolitical consulting group, and also an instructor at the Real World Risk Institute with Nassim Taleb. Can you tell us a little bit about your institution first before we move on, the FACE?
Well, it's one-man show. Practically, I have been a director of the leading Austrian think tank based in Vienna for the last 13 years. And now I'm transitioning towards working with the private sector, covering geopolitical, geoeconomic risks, a lot of, what has been going on over the last several years, with a special focus, of course, on geopolitics.
Fantastic. Okay, so to start with the question, let's go to a serious question first. We'll get to nonsense questions in a little bit. But I just gave a speech last week in Miami when I was talking about similarities between the 1980 cost push inflation that Reagan inherited when he took office. And one of the things I talked about was that it was a new dawn of opening the doors to international trade and taking advantage of labor, inexpensive labor from developing countries. And now all of a sudden you fast forward to 2022, that seems like it's not happening, and you don't have high hopes for better trade relations in the next couple of years, better transfer of goods, transfer of labor over borders. What's your thoughts?
Oh yeah, absolutely agree. And in fact, I didn't have high hopes for that already before the pandemic began. So my basic case was already that we were in a deglobalization cycle, obviously since 2012, 2013, of course, one that was not manifested in all these relevant networks because the global flows were still intact. But with the pandemic and now with the decoupling becoming more obvious by the day, the decoupling between the United States and China, my basic case is that we are going to observe either a violent kind of decoupling. That means that the global system is going to split in two major parts, one centered around United States with partners and allies, and another one obviously centered around China. If China, of course, manages to convert this geoeconomic cloud that it has gathered over the last 30 years also into regional power projection. And once again, it's going to forge partnerships and alliances. It has to expand beyond its realm of influence towards African markets, European markets, and Latin American markets. So we are going to observe that, and this is going to have significant implications on global affairs and all these relevant networks, specifically trade, economics, finances, but also energy markets, and so on and so forth, so commodities. So this kind of global, just to wrap it up, global flows, the way we've been observing this phenomenon, starting with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because you named the 80s. And then, of course, we've practically witnessed an unanticipated outcome of this US-led globalization, to the point that now we are going to observe the reverse phenomenon. But we have no idea how this outcome will look like.
Is it just, so is it just a question of egos? Like when we sit on the sidelines and say, what the hell is going on? Why can't we move forward with our relationship, or why must we move backwards? And it always seems like politics get involved and someone has to play the tough guy. Is it strictly a matter of egos? And if we had the right people in charge, could we change the course?
I don't think that it's just a matter of ego. It's also, let's put it that way. First and foremost, probably the big difference to the 80s, to the 90s, to the previous, cycles in terms of globalization versus deglobalization is that right now we have a kind of a nexus between economics and politics. You can no longer, split these two worlds. Previously, you had the kind of parallel worlds, politics with, all these egomaniacs, if you like, the struggle for power. The struggle for power. This has been a kind of alternative universe, and the economics, the financial world, they have been doing their business, and there were no so many bridges in between. But right now, the nexus between economics and politics is so so narrow, and everything that is happening in the world of global affairs, big political powers and regional as well, is also affecting these networks of finances and economics, trade. So obviously it's not just about egos, it's also about competition, it's about concentration of global and regional power centers, it's about the competition in specific domains. Obviously the first being the political economy, right? Who is having the biggest geo-economic clout and can control these flows or can actually exercise influence. Also has the tools such as, let's say, sanctions or monetary tools such as the policy of central banks. You clearly see that this all has an effect on all relevant areas. But then again, it is, of course, also about, rising geopolitical actors. Once again, we just don't have an answer as to whether China will manage to transform this geo-economic cloud from the last 30 years into a real geopolitical power projection. But it is obvious that China is trying to do so. And that means also competition and rivalry. So it's not just about egos, it's about real power, state power competition.
Okay, I have one question, Bobby, then I'll let you ask a question. But one question with two parts, well, and 6 subsets. But anyway, in about 25 minutes, you'll be ready to ask a question. But the question, when you say either goods cross borders or armies cross borders, I've heard that my whole life. Do you believe that's an absolute is the first part of the question? And the second is, how does it play out? Where do we begin manufacturing? And how long does that transition take to bring our manufacturing back to more friendly countries?
Well, first and foremost, right now, as I said already, we have these 2 scenarios. Depending on which scenario it will, emerge, violent decoupling. That means speeded up one. We've seen that actually it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration. Both are going in the same direction now, with some decisions by Biden's administration pointing to the same direction. So take the CHIPS Act, the whole technological domain. This decoupling is continuing, but we have also a kind of a second scenario that points to a rather more peaceful systemic coexistence, where both United States and China decide that they need to cooperate and synergize in terms of, calming down the global economy, following the pandemic and so on, and then they simply try to somehow coexist. But I think that we are still in the first scenario. When it comes to the manufacturing, once again, it is about the ability of these 2 powers, because this is, so to say, the first tier, these are the systemic rivals. These are the 2 systemic competitors. Anything else is beyond them, right? So it's about the way how they will forge certain partnerships, exercise influence over partners and allies. And also it's about the way how they will ride the the wave of the 4th industrial revolution. So how quick and how successful they will be in all these critical technological domains. Once again, it's a question mark because we don't know exactly the speed, the scale of these technological breakthroughs. But obviously, once again, these are the two front runners. Everyone else is lagging behind. And then again, if this creates a bifurcation, so imagine once again a kind of bipolarization, the question is, what about the rest? What about all of these other relevant regional powers that can offer, let's say, you mentioned manufacturing. The same goes for reconfiguration of supply chains. So it's going to be a competition over the hearts and minds of potential and relevant and loyal, if you like, and predictable partners and allies. And just to give you one example, I argue that, in fact, Russia sided already with China before it took the decision to make a move on Ukraine. So practically it was already recognizing this kind of bifurcation. And it was like, okay, we're going to side with the Chinese because we need all this liquidity. They're going to support us in a comprehensive manner. And this will be the only avenue for, let's say, survival, but also bypassing of the Western sanctions once we, launch a full-scale war on Ukraine. This is just one example. So some countries will be siding. We saw this also with the Australian case. Australia entered the security pact with the Americans and with UK last year, and this created a huge, downside effect because of their geoeconomic connections, the geoeconomic ties with the Chinese. But most of the regional powers right now are kind of oscillating. They do not want to, be confronted with either or choices. They want to offer choices to both sides. And I think that this is going to be the transitionary period, which will create a lot of positive effects because of this competition for those in between.
Bobby?
Yeah, I have, Velina, so many questions. I don't even know where to begin. So I just want to kind of start with a simple one. I was reading your recent essay, and we'll try to put the link up for if anybody wants to read it. We'll put it in the description in both Spotify and hopefully YouTube. It's not me that does that. But I got to the part where you talk about the political economy of the systematic competition. And a line in here, admittedly, the geopolitics that you cover so well is a secondary thing for me. I only look at it as it affects markets. So I read this line and I thought I need to ask her about this. Any competitor strong enough to question the dominance of a global power would seize the opportunity to fill the gaps whenever they may present themselves, as we are currently observing in Afghanistan. So since Afghanistan rarely has an effect on any of the economic indicators or markets that I watch, what are we seeing in Afghanistan that you're referring to, and how does that apply to the larger world?
Well, my base case, for instance, for Afghanistan has been that that America, in fact, wanted to withdraw. The way how they withdrew from Afghanistan was, an absolute disaster. But the decision to withdraw was critically important from a U.S. point of view. Why? Because they created a security problem for the Chinese. Afghanistan borders China. It created a huge security vacuum next to, not just the border of China, but given all these terrorist networks on the ground, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Central Asia. In the Central Asian terrain. This is, of course, still a huge problem for the Chinese. And by doing so, by withdrawing, they practically opened up a huge gap for them. And it was actually the strongest signal for me personally that something was about to happen was the way how Russians and Chinese were coordinating politically months before the withdrawal happened, starting, all these closed door ties, talks with the Taliban and so on. So obviously the Chinese will have to invest a huge amount of time, resources, and military boots on the ground to actually stabilize South and Central Asia, which once again proves actually my thesis on the modus vivendi of coordination between Russia and China that goes beyond Eastern Europe and Europe. And that is that the Chinese will need, actually China will need Russia for, for this military role. It's going to be a formula of splitting of tasks and functions where the Russians are going to play this regional mercenary power role for the Chinese geoeconomic interests, and then think of the new possibilities in terms of transit corridors, connectivities, natural resources. Think of the minerals that would be, let's say, mined and then processed in China in terms of the global, the so-called global decarbonization. I mean, once again, you see that it's not just about the security, but it's about the huge potential geoeconomic cloud that can be extracted from Afghanistan. Unfortunately, once again, Afghanistan may turn into this kind of, let's say, arena for the geoeconomic interests of external powers. And this is something that the Americans never did in the 20 years. They have never established any kind of connectivity corridors to practically bridge Central and South Asia, and then of course West Asia, which is now the Middle Eastern corridor. And this is, I think, something that the Chinese will be eyeing in this decade. They will be looking for alternative terrestrial corridors because they need a hedge strategy, an insurance, if you like, if the Indo-Pacific maritime lines, which are still under American control and control by the American allies, are going to be blockaded in the future.
So I think I know where you stand on this, but I wanted to ask you to sort of get in the mind of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party from a perspective of, obviously, I think a lot of people were surprised. I know Jim and I both were May of 2019, or I think it was late April, where President Biden basically said the Chinese are not competition for us. And here we sit now in December of 2022, and Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden and the entire administration is basically almost singularly focused in terms of geopolitical national strategy on somehow competing with China, even though the president in 2019 said they're not competition. We've known it was bipartisan. Which power, whether you're looking at the US or power in your opinion, or US or China rather, in your opinion, which one has bend in them? I mean, again, I read your note, so I think I know where you stand on this, but would you see there being a possibility for cooperation more on the US side, the Chinese side, or is that just not going to happen?
Well, we will be, of course, observing talks and diplomatic shuttles on specific topics. China and United States, they will have to communicate. And this is going to happen in terms of military to military talks, in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, big topic because China is not a part of any kind of international nuclear non-proliferation talks, as it was the case between Russia and the United States. So we will have this kind of meetings in the future as well. But once again, whether it's going to be rather the democratic approach, that means, more about involving multilateral institutions and agreements, forging blocks, alliances, partnerships, or is going to be more the Republican approach that is going to be more like a bilateral track or approach where you are going to look for, let's say, more predictable, loyal partners in all corners of the world, and then engaging them against China. We are going forward with this decoupling, the one way or the other. And one thing that I want you to understand is that it's a mutual thing. I mean, the Chinese are also actually speeding up the process in all these relevant domains. They want this entanglement to happen, and of course they play for time. Obviously they want to gain more time, which is why Russia's war against Ukraine has the perfect timing. I mean, obviously they have counted on the fact, or let's say an anticipation that the war will not be that long. So this was a huge disappointment. But so long as the Russians are keeping the Americans and the Europeans busy on the old continent, that's good news. That's good news for China, because it's now that Xi has cemented his power, has purged his own party, has surrounded himself by loyal, nationalists and party members and military hawks. He is going to focus on the political stability at home, on the economic outlook. We know about the failed zero COVID policy by the Communist Party. This is going to be the big issue in the short term. So every day that Russia keeps America and Europe busy on the old continent is actually a good news for the Chinese strategy.
Okay, so here now, this is pushback time, because I've heard everything you said, and there's one thing that doesn't make sense to me unless you can explain it. Okay, the last time we were involved in a Cold War, which just that you're kind of describing, Cold War 2.0, it seems like, right? And what happened was Gorbachev took over in Russia, Reagan took over here. We broke them economically by driving oil down to $9 a barrel, whatever it was, and then all of a sudden they got together and worked things out. My question to this is, you make it sound like it's absolute and it's one direction and there's no way to get us off that path. If just a few key people in the three countries involved change seats and people who are more motivated for compromise take those seats, can't we get us off that track?
I don't think that we are going to see this kind of political shift in the short term. First. Second, we have a very different situation than, as compared to Cold War, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, because the Soviet Union was not part of the US-led socioeconomic networks. And once the Soviet Union collapsed, the world moved on. It was a devastating period for the Soviet bloc, but it was not a devastating period for the global economy and trade. But if something similar happens during this, decoupling process, and like I said, it's a question mark how exactly this is going to happen. But in the short term, I just don't see, any signals or trends, projections that point to the other direction, that there would be a readiness on the one side or on the other side, to turn the processes into the other direction. I just don't see this happening based on the trends and the signals that are coming from both sides. So we don't have actually any answers to these questions. What it means, a real disentanglement, given that China has become part of all these relevant US-led socioeconomic networks over such a long period of time.
So, Bobby, one more for me, and then bring it back in. The question is this: is that the things we are talking about right here, to me, it smacks of inflation. It smacks of inflation in metals markets, in goods that are manufactured in China, and supply chains. You find this to be very, very inflationary, correct?
Absolutely, very inflationary. Just take the example of supply chains. So if you think that reconfiguration of supply chains is going to take like a few years, no, that's not the case. These are highly technical processes. It will take 10 to 15 to 20 years. All of these flows have been disrupted. Now they are looking, for alternative transport routes, energy corridors. We have all these disruptions in the most relevant socioeconomic network. So it's not just about the global trade. It's not just about the global economy. As you've been observing, it's also about commodities, about energy. So it's going to be a disruption par excellence, and it's going to take a lot of time. And this transitionary period is going to be highly disruptive in terms of also inflation. And as we've seen here in Europe, I mean, we've been in this kind of scenario even before Russia launched a war against Ukraine. So obviously the war was also inflationary. And that is, I think, next to the decoupling and next to this kind of bifurcation as a systemic process, highly inflationary, I would say. And of course, the access to natural resources, commodities, given the fact that there is also a huge dichotomy between the decision-making in the West, like take America, for example, or European powers. They have decided to decarbonize, let's say by 2050, fully decarbonize, whatever that means. And then you take countries such as India or China that have decided to fully decarbonize not early than 2060, 2070. This is a huge gap. That means that in some, the fossil fuels will be flowing in some directions, but then again, not in other directions. So in some parts of the world, there will be further, demand for certain commodities, but then again, in other parts of the world, this kind of dichotomy is going to further disrupt, exactly this kind of markets, the globalized market. So once again, we have a lot more questions than answers. So my task is actually to point to the critical uncertainties and to point to the trends projections rather than to give you answers, in terms of clear outcomes.
You already gave some answers. You said, I heard you say buy copper, buy lithium, buy cobalt. Yeah. That's what I heard from that. Yeah. Bobby, what do you got?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Velina, in terms of sort of strength of the party, how would you compare the Chinese Communist Party now to maybe, I don't know, Brezhnev's Russia? I mean, you look at it from, if you go from, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Berlin Wall falling, you're talking about 27 years, somewhere around there, 27, 28 years between the two things. And if we were to take Jimmy's more optimistic potential view and say, well, all we need is some people to switch chairs to get out of this sort of Cold War 2.0, which I really like that name, Jimmy. Would you say that there's more of a sort of an ironclad control in the Chinese Communist Party than, say, Russia of the 60s?
Well, we are obviously now entering, it's interesting because this 20th Congress of the Communist Party was a kind of manifestation of the next stage of the development of the Communist Party in China and also the establishment, the political elite. And this third mandate of Xi is going to be a very different one. The party and elite are turning more nationalistic, which is why we've also observed the most severe fourth Taiwan crisis so far, following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But once again, I, for instance, do not see a military attack by China on Taiwan. In fact, I would rather expect, exactly. So it's not just about bad news, in fact. So no World War III whatsoever. There is no interest actually in a direct military confrontation. So both powers, the United States and China, do realize that there is, no need for getting involved in a direct military confrontation, which is why, I went for the case of Cold War 2.0 with a question mark, because once again, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. But it's going to be a more nationalistic, more, more hardening political establishment in China, one that is going to need more foreign policy, let's say, achievements, which is why, given the competition with India is projected to become world's third economic power in this decade. It already overtook UK as the fifth economic power. So India is going to be on the winning side when it comes to these reconfigurations and the Indo-Pacific alliances of the United States. And then again, if you have also the example of Taiwan, they will obviously need some kind of foreign policy gains, and being surrounded by military hawks next to nationalist and loyal Communist Party members. My anticipation is that we are going to see a phase in which there will be a lot more coming out in terms of assertiveness, showing another face of China to the world. There is not going to be any further restraint, and non-involvement in global affairs. None of it. We are going to see a very active face. China showing, its diplomatic clout. International, regional organizations are already under certain Chinese influence. Take the Security Council as an example, regional organizations such as the Shanghai Organization, and for cooperation, and that kind of regional partnerships where, once again, the Chinese approach will be a very different one, more assertive, more proactive, if you like. So it's going to be a very different than what you actually described as the 60s 70s of the Soviet Union. Are we going to see another Cuban Missile Crisis? If that is what you are alluring to, you need to understand that if there is one thing that the Chinese Communist Party has studied very carefully over the whole period of the last 30 years, that is actually the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they have fanatically studied the whole history of the Soviet Union. And I think that they have learned also a few lessons given, the experience of the Soviet Union, what were the failures of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So I think that now they are also observing very carefully what is happening in Europe with the military failures of Russia against Ukraine. And I think that this is also actually an optimistic, message for our listeners, viewers, is that they would be very cautious to not, get involved in a military adventure, let's say in the Strait of Taiwan, given all the risks that this kind of military attack may bring. And in reality, the same goes for nuclear, for the question of the potential use of nukes, right? There is a clear red line that China already communicated regarding the possible use of nuclear weapons. And if Russia would use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, that would mean that the support coming from China, but also countries like India, will be gone. That will be an absolute red line. And I think that this is also very clear, not like the red line of Obama in Syria, but the real clear red line this time on behalf of the United States, if nukes are to be used.
First of all, thank you for taking that quick shot at Obama. We like a lot of sarcasm, we like a lot of ridicule, and finally you did that, and that's fabulous. I think you brushed over something a bit ago that I think is critical to our discussions in macroeconomics. So you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that our focus, our trade relationship with China will slowly, it has to shift over to India. So in this whole scenario, India could be a huge winner. And over the next decade, 2 decades, India's economy could benefit substantially by a greater and tighter relationship with the US. Is that what you're saying?
Or is India the prize of this whole Cold War? Is India the prize between the two countries?
No, India is certainly not the prize, but India will be one of the big winners. I'm very bullish on India. And India is not going to overtly side with the United States because they have their own, let's say, non-alignment policy. They were also a leader of the non-alignment movement during the Cold War. And once again, they will be probably kind of their own hub of regional power projection, but they will be obviously supporting and promoting a lot of the Indo-Pacific approach of the United States, together with other partners such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, and so on. So ASEAN, the ASEAN region, the Southeast Asian region, and India will be definitely on the winning side of this global and regional supply chains reconfigurations. Also, when it comes to the technological domain, think of think of the chips, the semiconductors. Taiwan cannot be the only, front runner. So there will be a lot also happening in India and this part of the world. So definitely, if I have to point to one winner of this competition, and also they don't see, when it comes to the military tensions with China, in fact, it is a kind of a curious phenomenon, because I argue that India does not need the United States to cope with the Chinese along the line of actual control, when they have these episodes of military tensions, as much as United States would need India to cope with China in, let's say, in the Indo-Pacific domain, in the Indo-Pacific maritime domain, or in the South China Sea basin, like the Strait of Taiwan.
Is there a okay, I want to be careful how I ask this question, because
no, we don't be careful on this podcast. Swing away.
All right. At my core, I just don't like war in general. So obviously, when one country invades another, the initial reaction is, why did they do that? And then when you start to dig into it, I don't want to talk about any of the things that I don't find to be credible, or at least I don't have the sort of capacity to find out if they're credible or not. But obviously, NATO for years and years and years encroached in areas they said they would not. And we've seen repeated warnings over the last decade from Putin saying, hey, you're not supposed to do this, right? NATO kept encroaching and expanding. Where do you fall on that? I mean, obviously, he took it the wrong way by invading a sovereign nation. And just for people who don't have a good ear for accents, Velina is not Russian, nor is she Ukrainian. So where do you fall in where the sort of, not fault lies, but did Putin overreact? Did he have a credible argument in the first place, and he just took the wrong path? Where do you fall in that conflict?
If I have to wrap it up for you in, a very short, let's say, few sentences. I argue that Putin's plans and calculus on this war have been let's say three-dimensional. So of course, first and foremost, it was and it's still about the complete political, economic, and social subjugation of the second largest European country, by the way. It's just for you to imagine, you're taking over France in terms of size, right? Okay. So it is, this goal hasn't changed. And they are still aiming for that. Why do they want to subjugate Ukraine? Why is Putin actually still pursuing this goal? Is because he wants to create big economic and geopolitical union with the size of Ukraine, 44 million people, like I said, second largest European country, and then with Belarus, because the existence of the Belarusian president since 2020, since the presidential election, is actually dependent on Putin and on Putin's choices. So you build a big union and you practically destroyed the whole European security order. So the second dimension of this goal, of this calculus, is aimed at Europe. You no longer see yourself as being on the winning side. This European security order doesn't work for you. You're excluded. You feel like there is no space. So obviously, what you want to do is also to destroy this security order that has been based on international, regional treaties, organizations, and so on and so forth. And by making such move on Ukraine, by winning against Ukraine, by destroying the security order. You create a concert of powers, like in the 19th century, a chaos, political chaos. You destroy, this order, and then you can penetrate. You can actually make new deals with one power or the other. You have suddenly a lot of open space and of vacuum. And this is what, a revisionist power wants actually to destroy the status quo, whereas most of the European powers are status quo powers. They like it the way it is. They don't want a war, obviously. So second dimension, it's about Europe. Putin has launched a non-kinetic war. That means a war by non-military means against European powers on the 24th of February. Now, most of the European powers, most of the European decision makers do not even understand it, because they are still operating in this mindset of status quo. You're so happy with the heritage, with the institutional heritage, with the geo-economic status quo that you have, and that you have been enjoying over the last 30 years of, more than 70 years of peace, the last 30 years being on the winning side after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Everything is fine. You have crises, but okay, somehow you have been managing these crises, as a group of 27 powers within the European Union. And then you have also the European NATO members. More of the European countries are also NATO members. So these are status quo powers. They do not want any change. They want to keep it the way it was. And you have a big cleavage here. So this non-kinetic war means not just using dependencies like we've seen with the energy, cutting off the gas supply. There is no oil supply, meanwhile. Coal supplies also cut off, but also using fertilizers, food, the fear of migration flows, the nuclear blackmail, and then you have an information warfare, a classic, classic tool that the Soviet Union has been more or less perfecting over, decades. And the third dimension is that Russia saw itself as a kind of first-tier country, obviously not a systemic power, not having this kind of global power projection anymore, but by triggering systemic competition, an overt systemic competition, let's say a systemic conflict between the United States and China, because Moscow anticipated that China would have to take the side of Russia this time, and it would have to do it in an overt manner, not just with few diplomatic statements, but with political, investments. And they did it. They took the Russian narratives about NATO expansion. They supported Russia in all relevant international organizations. They have been providing a lot of economic aid. They have been buying the Russian oil and gas, the commodities. And it's a kind of a perfect modus vivendi of coordination. So by doing this is a third dimension. Russia sought to win the war, to destroy the security order in Europe, and then position itself as this indispensable power. You have a pole position in a new systemic competition, and both rivals have to talk with you. They have to, because you change the equilibrium immediately. You are this kind of, if you like, wild card, like India is going to be. But India, obviously, because of its competition with China, is always going to be more open to, the American decision makers. But in the case of Russia, Russia can use this as a leverage against both China
the expansion of NATO, or the expansion of NATO, is just an excuse that Putin used.
Let me give you an example.
Plan he wanted to do anyway. Is that correct?
Yes, let me give you an example with NATO. In fact, what Putin did with making this kind of move on Ukraine, launching a full-scale war against Ukraine, is to accelerate NATO enlargement, because two neutral powers, two neutral countries, the one being neutral for the last 250 years, and the other one being neutral since the end of the Second World War, decided to not just be more active within the European security and defense policy, but they decided from one day to the next to actually apply for a membership in NATO. And in fact, this, and I argue that the whole narrative by Putin that he had to launch a full-scale war against Ukraine to prevent NATO expansion from happening. In fact, he triggered NATO. He gave NATO a new meaning, and let's say he added two new NATO members, because it's only about Turkey and Hungary, and both already signaled that they will be also ratifying, the membership of, of Finland and Sweden. So obviously, next year we will have two more NATO members, and I argue that Ukraine, in fact, was not attacked by Russia because it was striving to enter NATO, but it actually was attacked by Russia because it wasn't NATO member.
Okay, well, just to clear that up, the answer, because this is what I heard, and because then I have another question I want to get to too. So if someone who was highly critical of the narrative said, well, if NATO wasn't threatening expansion, Putin would have been pushed into that. You're saying that that's nonsense, that NATO increased and threatened expansion because of Putin, and because Putin was eventually going to do something like this to increase. That's what you're saying, correct?
Absolutely. This is what I'm saying. And also expansion is something, I like that. In geopolitical terms, powers have to wage wars again and again to expand their territories, and this is what Russia is doing right now. Russia is waging
I wasn't
a war.
questioning. I wasn't questioning that.
But NATO expansion means but NATO expansion means that NATO is waging wars against countries to expand its territories. It's a big difference because none of these countries actually joined NATO because NATO was threatening them. You see, this is a big difference in the narrative. It is a NATO enlargement. That means you you apply for a membership based on your free will. You want to join, and then you have to fulfill conditions to join. And that means enlargement, not expansion. Expansion is something that has to happen against your will, against the will of a state. You are expand contrary to someone else's interests and objectives. This is what expansion is.
Expansion is something that happens to you. Enlargement is something that you do.
That you want to join because you want to be part of something, and then mostly you have to fulfill conditions. And I will give you the other example with the European enlargement. If we follow the same logic, we should actually say European expansion. But the European Union did not wage wars to expand towards the Central Eastern, European countries, which wanted to become part of the common market. Now we have the counterexample with UK. UK wanted to exit. And now, with the Brexit, we have 27 instead of 28 members. But the European Union did not wage a war against the UK, because this expansion, if we use the same Russian narrative, was shrinking back towards, losing one of the biggest European powers. Now that it's not longer part of the European Union. So this logic of expansion against enlargement is a very, very good example how actually narratives are being created. By the way, the Chinese officials, diplomatic officials, were spreading this from day one of the war. You can find it everywhere on social media, using exactly that kind of thing to practically create a perception.
Yeah, that's obviously where I found it, and why I wanted to ask you that question. I'm sure I'm going to be attacked as if I somehow was defending Russia. I'm not defending anybody. I don't know enough, so I wanted to ask someone who does the question.
Oh, yeah, and I thought that hopefully we didn't get you riled up, because I don't know shit. We have you on to explain this stuff to us, and I appreciate that very much. But again, we do look at everything with a critical eye, and I'm glad we do, but I'm glad you explained that very well. But to wind it back to something, where are you located? In Europe, did you say?
In Vienna. That's
in Vienna. How many languages? How many
That's at
languages
the
do you
heart
speak?
of Europe, as they like to say, because it's really between west and east, north and south. It's really in the middle.
And that's why Hitler decided to march on them early, correct?
Not expand, but annex.
Exactly. Annex. There's a big difference. How many languages do you speak? My guess is 5.
Yes.
5 exactly?
Yes.
What's your favorite language? I heard you say something French earlier, and you said it so perfectly. What's your favorite language of all the
Par
languages you speak?
excellence, I said, I think.
You did. Well, it was beautiful. Yeah.
I like my mother tongue best.
Which is what?
Bulgarian.
Which, and also because the rest of the world tends to look at the Eastern European languages as not the most beautiful. Do you defend it because of that? Is that why you choose Bulgarian?
It actually, it sounds really ugly. Most of the people think that when I speak my mother tongue, I'm practically arguing with the person. It sounds really...
There's such hard sounds in those
very
languages.
Hard sound, yes.
Yes, Polish.
We get that, Jimmy. People always think Jimmy and I are arguing, but we've been doing this for 20 years.
Right, we're just talking. So I wanted to ask one more question before we let you go, but I know your whole Friday isn't going to be for us. But it sounds like what you're depicting in the United States and in Europe is going to be somewhat of a different life, and the excesses and the wonderful cheap goods that we've had for 30 years, we're nearing an end. So lifestyle is going to change. Hopefully not dramatically, but significantly. That's exactly what you're saying, correct?
Yes, that's my main, one of my main theses. Yes, it's going to be over more or less.
Okay, Bobby, what do you got? Anything before? Then with two guests in a row, we had Luke Groman, by the way. I don't know if you're familiar with Luke Velina, but he was on last week, and he painted a pretty grim picture too. And as you paint, it's not that grim a picture. It's a realistic picture, and that's what we go for.
This was a much less grim picture than Luke painted.
But yours is much less grim than Luke's. Yeah, right. Yeah. You're a ray of sunshine.
Actually, I argue that I just want to have the right diagnostic, because if you don't have the right diagnostic, everything that we derive from wrong diagnostic will be wrong. Will be the wrong medicine, right? To treat.
I agree.
The symptoms of
the wrong medicine in this day and age is probably not the right phrase. Here's my question for you. And again, thank you for this, because honestly, your no World War III was very soothing, honestly, when you said that, because we respect the hell out of your brain. But I want to know which country you think laughs the loudest at US woke ideology. That's really what I want to know. Which country laughs the loudest at some of the things that are going on in the United States right now?
You mean which countries are into this kind of ideology? Do I?
Let me say
who's making fun of us?
Who's making fun of us? And I'll give you an actual example. I don't remember his last name. Yoel something or other said that being a moderator on Twitter while Trump was president, he felt trauma.
Oh, trauma.
Yeah, and I just don't understand using the word trauma when you're being paid 6 or 7 figures to moderate a chat room, calling any of that trauma when you consider some of the things that went on in the Slavic countries and in some of the third world countries, in their histories. So I'm curious as to what country laughs at these sort of weak. I don't know. I'm gonna stop right there.
Okay.
Do you feel that we're weak, America?
Okay. So I have to be very careful, because now it's becoming
you have to be careful. We don't have to be careful.
It's becoming very personal, It's actually.
That's why I asked you which country is laughing. If you say it's Bulgaria, I'm going to know it's you.
I would say that there is indeed a kind of big difference how, for instance, Central Eastern European countries, which are obviously the former Soviet bloc, are looking at certain developments in the United States, while being actually still the biggest fans of America. I mean, as compared to, let's say, what is here often described as old Europe, but practically it's the core Europe, the one that has been the engine of the European Union before all these processes began in the 90s, the French, German, bloc and all the countries around. So there is this kind of difference in the perception, what is going on in Europe. The Western part of Europe, this older bloc, they are like big fans of the democratic administrations, because they know that this is going to be an administration that will be in favor of institutional cooperation, European Union, United States cooperation. And they are more into this, let's say, woke kind of.
Say bullshit.
But old versus new is a kind of dividing line that we are having right now, and we have been having here in Europe. So Central Eastern European countries, the old Soviet, the former Soviet bloc, these are countries that have a kind of allergy against anything that has to do with Marxist tones and characteristics. Mm-hmm. It can be hidden behind green agendas. It can be hidden behind any woke agenda. Okay, it can be hidden behind all of this kind of. So anything that has like a Marxist tone, we are very much allergic against it, because we see that all these class struggles that were artificially created during the Cold War, we were fighting the bad capitalists, right? We had these class struggles, but you can create dividing lines also based on gender or based on any other. Now, for instance, green, how woke are you in terms of green agenda? How quickly do you want to speed up these processes towards decarbonization, stuff like that? So we are very much aware of that. I have been observing a very interesting similar discussion, for instance, coming from India right now. I have a friend who is actually now publishing a big book on that, exactly on this kind of woke culture. And it's very interesting because he's based in United States, but he's an Indian, and he has produced this big publication on exactly this matter, given the fact that India has some provinces also with the Communist Party. So it's a very, very dichotomic society. It's not a coherent one. So I think that we are going to have a very, we don't have a coherent approach on that. You cannot generalize on that matter, but this is obviously something where I would put myself on, let's say, on the side of being very cautious about it. I just don't buy into it. And I see myself coming from also a kind of society that has become very anti-fragile when it comes to all these kind of crises. We've seen hyperinflation already in the 90s, a real hyperinflation, like lasting more than a year. Most of the Europeans on the other side of, on the other side of Europe, in the Western Europe, they haven't seen such thing. Right. They haven't experienced that kind of thing. And next to war, hyperinflation is the most horrible thing that can happen to a human being. I can assure you. A big, speaking from a personal experience. So this kind of crisis, we are, we have had communist rule, we have had practically almost everything. So we won't be scared of, or let's say this kind of woke culture is not something that we can easily buy into it, which is why now we have all these also populist movements that go in both directions. You're gonna witness a lot with crises, with inflationary crises. You're gonna witness a lot of, far right, far left kind of extremes. That's unfortunate. The center disappears and the extremes become stronger and stronger.
Very unfortunate.
Funny that you mentioned that. Bobby and I are from Chicago, and I don't know if you associate it, but in the United States, Chicago is basically a Polish city. That's what so like I count at least 10 friends in the Chicago area who are immigrants from Poland, and they think exactly the way that you say. Their fists are up like this anytime the government starts telling us the way to think and what we're supposed to do. And I think that's
we are
very
allergic. We are allergic against that. We are allergic against any centralization of power. So first thing that happens, and also coming from society, when a group tries to tell you what the rules of the game are.
Then we give them that. Exactly. Yes.
Exactly.
That's
So that's in our DNA.
It's no coincidence that I have 10 Polish friends, because I like the Polish people because they think like I think. Exactly.
So it's super interesting. If you have time for just a 2-minute story, when I was working in a pretty large brokerage firm, there was a Bulgarian woman named, she wouldn't mind me saying her name, Elena Tombeva, who came to work for me and barely spoke English when she came to work for me. She went on basically to go to school at night, do all the work. She went from basically getting me coffee, because that's all I had for her to do at the time, to going to Morgan Stanley. And now she works at the Milken Institute, just worked and worked and worked. And as we became social, where it wasn't just employer-employee, she would hang around with myself and my wife and our group of friends and her and her boyfriend. And she offended every single American-born person. Now, I tell everyone that I'm first generation here, but I spoke Italian before I spoke English. She never once offended me. I just knew that, Eastern Europeans, as a general rule, they give their opinion. They
tell you what they think. That's what we like about it.
Exactly.
They don't care if you give your opinion to them.
Yes.
And she would sit me down in the office and go, "Why is everybody so mad at me?" I'm like, "Because you say what you think. You need to stop doing that if you want to be American."
Yes. Same goes for, that's also a big difference, I would say. Yeah. That is something that I would like to confirm, that it goes
good. Don't change.
It goes in both directions, on both sides of the Atlantic. It's the same. And probably this has also a lot to do with the harsh reality. If you have been living in a society where you were practically being spied by your own relatives and co-workers, everyone was spying on everyone, and you were paying attention what you were saying, right? And then at some point of time, finally, that's over. You're not going to remain silent.
No way. Want you to stay
no way. You're remaining silent. No way.
We want you to stay the queen of fucking everything, Velina. Okay, just stay there.
I will promise that there will be more coming out in the new year.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Velina. This has been fun. It's such a fun, different track for us to not specifically talk about the stock market, the bond market. And thank you for opening my eyes to a lot of things. Hopefully you'll come back again if it was fun for you.
Thank you. I will be listening to you are invited now on Complete Intelligence, right? By Tony. I will be listening to your show.
I did that today.
Energy. Okay. Yes, on energy. And of course, there will be a lot of opportunities. Just to finish with a positive note, there will be a lot of opportunities, a lot of avenues for actually cooperation, given the fact that now there are more players. And the cake is the same. So more players creates more competition, and more competition is not necessarily something negative. On the opposite, it creates actually it makes through the competition everyone wants to get better, and that I think is going to be the good news out of a lot of negative news that we've covered in this conversation, specifically in parts of the world such as Africa. It's not going to be only about this big scramble for natural resources, but it's going to be also a lot of potential to improve the life of ordinary people, and ordinary people in Europe, in America, in all of these parts of the world.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's going to be it for me. I'm heading to the bar. Thank you so much. It was really fun.
That sounds like a good plan. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Bye. Bye.
Good night, guys.